Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video overall that might be a little bit longer in length, maybe about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit over, but we'll see overall what mainly happens. But overall, I wanted to review this video because this is once again going to be a topic about the top 10 pound for pound list and who truly, in my view, and not just in my view, but a couple of other people's view, who truly deserves to be there. And when you talk about a top 10 list, not only within boxing, but also when you talk about it in other sports as well, whether it be NBA basketball or NFL football or tennis or something of a sort, or whatever sport you may watch, UFC, those are all the main ones that I tend to watch. You are going to have some consistent and logical reasons to why you haven't ranked that way. And if you really don't have any logical or objective reasons for having your list ranked that way, what that means is that when you're ranking things, you can't really be relied upon. It just is what it is. And ESPN, as of recent, they did come out with their list or their top 10 pound for pound list. And Dante, of course, is going to allege that he believes that there is some racism afoot because they do not have either Jermell Charlo nor overall Mr. Devin Haney on the list. And what I will say about ESPN's list is this: I certainly don't always agree with what ESPN has to say. And do I believe that sometimes there is some quote unquote racial overall motivations for ESPN's list? I think that you can certainly allege that. I don't think that there's any problem with that. But the thing is also with Dante, and this is why I like to talk about both ESPN and channels like these, like a Dante's Boxing Nation, is because Dante a lot of the times will try to sucker you in and basically say, see, this is what they're doing to our black athletes. You know, we're so dominant in the sport when it comes down to it that they don't want to include a lot of other guys on this list. This list overall should have 90% black American fighters, but they just want to keep us down. And listen, some of the times when it comes down to it, could there maybe be some truth in that? Maybe a little bit. But oftentimes, in my opinion, Dante takes it way too far. And if we take a look at this pound for pound list, at least that ESPN has, I wouldn't say that it's the worst pound for pound list that I've seen. Would I agree with every single one of the rankings? No, I wouldn't. But at the end of the day, once again, you are going to have a logical reasoning to put that fighter there. But the thing that I always have with Dante, the problem that I always have with his rankings is that he always loves to complain about how allegedly there's so much racism going around and racial double standards. But Dante overall is pretty much one of the biggest over emotional pro racial fans that I've personally ever seen when it comes to boxing, period. Point blank. So just like ESPN and just like sometimes some of these other commentators, Dante cannot be relied upon either because we all know what Dante's motivations are going to be. His motivations basically are how many black American fighters can I put on this top 10 pound for pound list? And listen, if 90% of the top 10 pound for pound fighters end up being black American fighters, then it is what it is. No problem. But right now, in my view, the pound for pound list is extremely competitive when it comes down to it. So you can argue a certain amount of fighters there. My point being is this: when you rank things, you have to have a logical and objective consistency. And when you rank things, you can't have a racial bias, or at least try your hardest not to. That's just how things have to be ranked. We can't rank things basically off of preference for people. We can't rank things overall basically because we're a fan of somebody. We have to rank things based off of a logical and objective consistency. And that's what I always try to do on my top 10 pound per pound list when I release my own. All right, so it is what it is. But anyways, Mr. Dante is going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So currently, there are only two undefeated, undisputed champions in the sport of boxing today. That's Jermell Charlo, and the youngest in the whole sport is Devin Haney. Neither one of them are on.
Well, actually, no, Josh Taylor is also undefeated and undisputed. But anyway.
ESPN.
But I believe Dante corrected himself later on to where he said that, he was talking about a difference.
Pound for pound.
But that just goes to show you that even though he always tries to hype up Josh Taylor, his main focus was never Josh Taylor. I've already told people this a multitude of times because I'm usually very good at pointing out people's underlying detections or their emotions or what their true machinations are. Dante, he never hypes up Josh Taylor because he wants Josh Taylor to truly be within the top 5 pound per pound. The only reason why he wants him to be there is because he knows that if either Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence, whoever the winner is of that fight, if they beat Josh Taylor, he can say, wow, did you see that? They ended up beating a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. And in my opinion, even though for how talented Josh Taylor is, he never was top 5 pound-for-pound.
List. Now, right after Devin Haney beat George Kambosos and became undisputed, ESPN, they put Devin Haney on their list right away. But then maybe a week or two after they put him on the list, they kicked him off the list and replaced him with Beterbiev. And now they have Shakur Stevenson at number 10.
Well, what I'll say about Mr. Artur Beterbiev is this. If you have him on the top 10 pound-for-pound list, I really don't have an issue with that because Artur Beterbiev might be the most dominant performer in all the boxing right now, even when he is in the ring with A-grade fighters. Because I seen him in the ring with Vosdick, I seen him in the ring with Marcus Brown, and I also seen him in the ring with Joe Smith Jr., and he treated those guys like they were amateurs. I mean, Artur Beterbiev, you have a very serious argument, and he's almost completely unified. Now, of course, it doesn't mean much until you are completely unified, but Artur Beterbiev has 3 belts around his waist, and he has a decent resume for that division. He is absolutely demolishing these dudes within his weight division. So if you have him within the top 10, I would not have a problem with it. To me, he's anywhere within the top 15, just making the top 10 somewhere around there. He would not make my top 5, but when it comes down to it, I could see him maybe being around there. Now, would I personally put him over Dimitri Bivol or Devin Haney? Probably not, but you could maybe debate it if you wanted to. So I really don't see a huge problem with that one. And that is going to be a big argument when it comes to these pound-for-pound lists, is it actually debatable or is it ludicrous?
And Bam Bam Rodriguez, the fighter that Shakur Stevenson put on and continuously praised, ESPN, they said after Bam Bam Rodriguez's last fight, he's closing in on the pound-for-pound list.
Yes, and I already told people this. Shakur Stevenson, when he gave a compliment to Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, DontesBoxingNation, the reason why he did not like that is because he basically said, I don't want to have to deal with certain people like this being on a pound-for-pound list later on. All right, because we want our pound-for-pound list to basically look like the Black American Fighters League. That's basically what we want to look at it as. And once again, most Black American fighters in the sport of boxing, they usually can be the most dominant in the sport. But right now, it is very, very mixed, and you are going to have to rank things logically and objectively. That's just how it is. That's just how it is. All right? Because you have people like Usyk up there. You have people like Canelo up there. You have people like Tyson Fury up there. You even have Naoya Inoue or Beterbiev or Josh Taylor or, maybe a few others that I'm not mentioning that you could easily debate there within your top 10 pound-for-pound list. So it is what it is.
So Bam Bam is only a fight or two away from replacing Shakur Stevenson on the list, on ESPN's list. And I can guarantee you guys, it's not going to matter who the opponent is that Bam Bam faces. As long as he's victorious, he will advance on ESPN's list. You guys already know what I say. The most dangerous weapon in the world is a microphone and a camera. So the reason why ESPN is so comfortable with putting out the most racist, whitewashed pound-for-pound list is because no one, when I say no one, I'm talking about none of the professional boxers or any other extremely influential people in the boxing world is exposing ESPN. They seldomly ever expose.
Well, I'm not quite so sure about that. Because Terrence Crawford, Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson, these are all guys that have went after ESPN and always said that, they have some racist issues or that they have a racial bias. And don't get me wrong, is there sometimes a racial bias with ESPN that I believe happens? Yes, here and there, and, or even if you want to argue the majority of the time. And ESPN is not something that you want to rely on completely for rankings because they do have certain narratives afoot in every sport. But when it comes down to it, once again, like I said, Dante is not much better. But if you take a look at this list, like I said, you have Terrence Crawford, Inoue, Spence, Usyk, Canelo Alvarez, Fury, Beterbiev, Bivol, Lomachenko, and Stevenson. I mean, really the only fighter on this list that I probably definitely would not put on here is Mr. Vasily Lomachenko.
Them. And this just makes the racists even bolder. I mean, it's like someone coming to your house. They start stealing change, right? They start stealing change and sitting around. Once they know you don't notice it's missing, they start stealing more money. because they feel no one is paying attention and they keep getting away with it. But Devin Haney is paying attention, and this is what we need more people in the sport of boxing to do, because we over here at New Media, we can't do it all alone. They need to come out and expose old media when it comes to ESPN and whoever else is putting together these ridiculous, disrespectful pound-for-pound lists.
Well, is it really that disrespectful, Dante? Once again, let's take a look at the pound for pound list. It's not like they don't have any black fighters on the list. They have three. You have Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., and those are pretty much the only two black fighters, in my opinion. Maybe Devin Haney, if you want to add him. Those are pretty much the only 2 to 3 black fighters, in my opinion, in the sport right now that are definitively on the pound for pound list. Certain people may say, well, what about Gervonta Tank Davis? What about Jerron Boots Ennis? I think that those guys are very talented, but they don't have the resume. If we were to talk about Jermell Charlo, he's completely undisputed, but he does not have the skill set or the dominance, in my opinion, of some others when it comes down to it. And on top of that, just a few years ago, he lost to a debatable C-grade fighter in Tony Harrison. I've had certain people go back and forth with me, and they say, well, I believe that he's a B-grade fighter. Either way, if you're a person that is supposed to be one of the best champions in the world, you're not supposed to lose that fight the way that you did. A fighter that lost every championship caliber fight by knockout before he fought you, and then he beat you in that first fight. So Jermell Charlo would not even make my top 10 pound for pound list, but if he did, he would be at number 10 and no higher.
They're desperately trying to whitewash. Matter of fact, just to show you guys how important it is for the professional boxing community to expose these racist pound-for-pound lists by ESPN, I wasn't even going to make a video on this and report it because I've already exposed ESPN's racial double standards in their pound-for-pound list for so long. But I made this video because Devin Haney responded to the list, which made it more important to report. Devin Haney, he said the youngest undisputed champ of the 4-belt era and not on the pound-for-pound list is crazy, especially when you guys who don't even hold the Ring Magazine belt currently made the list. Everything Devin Haney said right there, it made sense. It was the whole truth. But to make the biggest impression, Devin needs to say it on a camera next time he's doing an interview with ESPN.
Well, I would somewhat agree with that, and I don't really have a problem with what Devin Haney said. He has the right to believe that he is on the top 10 pound per pound list, and I probably would have him on my top 10 pound per pound list. And if you wanted to make the case that if Devin Haney was a different complexion, would he be on the top 10 pound per pound list on ESPN? More than likely he would be. I have no doubt that ESPN probably does have certain racial biases when it comes down to it, no doubt about it. But once again, also the reason why I review at Dante's Boxing Nation is because a lot of the times, in my opinion, he takes that and he ups it by 20. And he just takes it usually way too far. Because to say that this list is just absolutely disrespectful and there's no way that a lot of these fighters are on here, I'm not really sure if I can agree with that. Now, in my opinion, Devin Haney, he certainly would be on the list over Vasily Lomachenko right now, who has no belts, and maybe a couple of other guys if, maybe I wanted to go there. But to say that this list is the worst that you've ever seen or that overall it's the most racist list, I'm not sure if I can agree with that. Now, do I believe that ESPN does have certain racial biases? Yes, I do. Just like Dante, I believe, has. But once again, there's a lot of people on this list that you can debate that do deserve to be on here.
That's the best way to really expose these double standards. Next time Devin or anyone is doing an interview with ESPN, get them to try to explain how it's possible that Devin Haney or Jermell Charlo is not on the list. But Inoue is on the list, and Canelo is on the list, who just came off of a loss. And that's why that microphone is such a dangerous weapon.
Well, Inoue, in my opinion, is debatably on the list. But Dante, you were the same one that was always debating that Terrence Crawford was over Vasily Lomachenko and Canelo because of his dominance, even though he was facing B and C grade fighters. So Naoya Inoue has debatably been the most dominant boxer within the past several years. So, once again, I have no doubt about it. If Naoya Inoue was a black fighter, Dante would absolutely have him within his top 10 pound per pound. No doubt about it.
They say
and Canelo Alvarez you have to have on your top 10 pound per pound list, but we all know why Dante doesn't want him there. Because Dante hates Canelo Alvarez's guts with a burning passion. He's always hated him because, once again, he doesn't want someone like a Canelo to be the number 1 pound for pound fighter. And he has to try to tear down Canelo on a daily basis because if Canelo somehow does come back, he knows he's going to be a threat once again to possibly getting that number one pound for pound spot. So anyway.
Is mightier than a sword. The same thing can be said about the mic. Guys, ESPN has Inoue, pound for pound number 2 on their list. The fact that they have Inoue...
I would agree, and I think that that's ridiculous. I've always stated that in my opinion that was ridiculous, and a certain amount of people may disagree with me. I had this one person overall that went back and forth with me on, and they said, well, it seems like you're letting your emotions get in the way. I don't let my emotions get in the way of anything that I commentate about. So it just is what it is. But the truth is about Inoue is that even though he is a very decent boxer, he has no definitive A-grade wins within his career. Now, he was able to defeat Nonito Donaire twice, especially after this most recent win. But you could debate that was even a greater win because Nonito Donaire was coming off with 2 decent wins of undefeated fighters. But one could also argue that Nonito Donaire, that he really has not mentally been the same fighter ever since he lost to Guillermo Rigondeaux. So, I like Inoue in a way, just like I like any of the other fighters on the list, but he should not be within the top 2 pound for pound. Really, in my view, he should not even be within the top 5. Because for you to make my top 5 pound for pound list, you overall have to have a very decent resume. You have to have an A-grade resume. That's why whenever I bring up my top 5 pound for pound list, I only bring up 5 boxers. I only bring up Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez, Alexander Usyk, Errol Spence Jr., and Terrence Crawford. Now, Crawford does not necessarily have an A-plus resume, but you could debate that at least it's in the A-grade category. Inoue, I don't think you could debate that at all.
At number 2.
Or at least certainly not A-plus or A. If it is A, it's A-minus.
That tells you without a doubt, if the 2 undisputed champions, Jermell Charlo and Devin Haney, were not black, they would both be 1 and 2 on the list. And honestly, they wouldn't even care. Old media wouldn't even care what their resume was.
Well, I'm not really sure that if they would be 1 or 2 on the list, Dante, but I understand the point that you're getting at.
It's the fact that they are undisputed alone. That's what they would use to justify them being number 1 and number 2. I mean, the list is comical. Canelo Alvarez just came...
Well, no, the list really isn't comical, but you're going to put it that way because you have your own racial issue as well. Because we all know what a DontesBoxingNation pound for pound list would look like. It just is what it is. Anyway.
Off of a loss. And they have him at number...
Yes, Canelo Alvarez is coming off of a loss, but Canelo Alvarez was the former undisputed number 1 pound for pound fighter for about a couple of years. And then on top of that, he still has all the belts of 168 pounds. So Canelo has to be on the list. You can like it, you can not like it, but that's just the bottom line. Now, a fighter, in my opinion, that no longer deserves to be on the list is Vasily Lomachenko. Now, Lomachenko, in my opinion, also was the former number 1 pound for pound fighter, but he can't be there right now. Because in that last 50-50 fight, you lost against Teofimo Lopez. So it just is what it is. And on top of that, you have no belts. So you can't be on the list for me.
5. But yet they, once again, don't even have Devin Haney and Jermell Charlo on the list. Listen, guys.
Well, in my opinion, Canelo Alvarez, even with his last recent loss, he's definitely above Jermell Charlo. And he's also above Devin Haney. It's no offense against those guys. They're very decent boxers. But they have not really done what Canelo Alvarez has done. It just is what it is.
A pound-for-pound list is supposed to be based on resume, skill, domination, and longevity.
Well, I would somewhat agree with you overall about that, Dante. But if you're going to argue those things, why would you have Canelo Alvarez off on your top 10 pound-for-pound list? Isn't that really going against your own sentiment? Because Canelo Alvarez basically has all those things in spades.
Meaning, how long are you going to be around? If we put you on this list, are you going to be on this list for quite some time?
Well, no, the pound-for-pound list, when it comes down to it, is not really about longevity. The pound-for-pound list is really about what you're doing in the moment. Longevity is all-time greatness. That's what that is. The pound-for-pound list is not overall about how long are you going to be there. All right, so let's cut that bullshit out. But I already know why Dante's doing that, and I'm going to release a couple videos about that. That's because he doesn't want Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury on the list. Because he basically tries to cut them down and degrade them because they said all in all that they may retire soon. Even though they're very clearly top 10 pound for pound fighters. So just stop that shit, Dante. Just stop.
Crawford is a perfect example. ESPN doesn't have Terrence Crawford at number one because they wanted to. They were forced to put him there at number one because they could not justify the fact that going all the way back to Chocolatito Gonzalez, to Lomachenko, and who else? Canelo Alvarez. They always had Terrence Crawford at number two, especially when it came to.
Well, you know what? Terrence Crawford really doesn't have anyone else but himself to blame. You can allege racism all you want, but listen, at the end of the day, and I'm not the only one that has stated overall that, in my view, that at the time Lomachenko was above him and that Canelo definitely was above him. Because Terrence Crawford, is no offense against him, but dude, you have almost 40-something fights on your resume, if not 40-something fights, and the only definitive A-grade fight that you have within your career is Sean Porter. That's saying a lot, all right? It just is what it is. I like Terrence. He's from my hometown. I love watching him. He's an excellent boxer, great boxer. But no, Terrence Crawford has never definitively ever been the number one pound for pound fighter, ever.
Lomachenko. Because I'm old enough to remember there was a time when Lomachenko was on the top of ESPN's pound for pound list, and they had Crawford at number two. And there was always that debate on who really.
Yes, and Lomachenko, when he was getting those A-grade wins, deserved to be over Terrence Bud Crawford. For you to have an elite resume, you have to get in those fights that are looked at as 50-50 fights or critical fights. And Terrence Crawford, I'm sorry, but knocking out Jose Benavidez and, Aegis Kavalaskas and Jeff Horn, like, come on. Are you kidding me?
Was number one, Lomachenko or Terrence Crawford. You see, they made the mistake of putting Terrence Crawford at number two. They didn't expect Lomachenko to lose. But when he did lose, they had no choice but to put Terrence Crawford at number one. Logically, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. But since...
Well, at that time, I did not have Terrence Bud Crawford at number two. And what Dante is going to basically say his point, and I get it to a degree overall, he basically says, well, they then surpassed Terrence Crawford with Canelo Alvarez. So that's why he believes that there's some racism afoot. But the problem is that Canelo Alvarez... he was already number two on my pound for pound list when Lomachenko was number one. That's why I never had Terrence Crawford at number two during that time, because he did not have the resume even close to Canelo, not even close.
ESPN doesn't usually base things on logic. All of a sudden, Canelo Alvarez...
Yes, you don't base things off of logic either. But anyway.
...comes out of nowhere on the list to where people are now talking, or at least on ESPN, they're debating who's number one out of Canelo and Terrence Crawford. When Canelo Alvarez...
In my opinion, when Canelo Alvarez was number one pound for pound, there really was no true debate. And the reason why that was is because Canelo Alvarez's resume, it completely mops the floor of Terrence Bud Crawford's resume. It's not even close. When you take a look at Canelo Alvarez's resume, he has Caleb Plant on there, who's a decent A-grade fighter. He had Callum Smith on there. He had Billy Joe Saunders. All those guys were undefeated champions when he fought them, when it came down to it. And then you're also talking about Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Miguel Cotto, Erislandy Lara. You're talking about overall, maybe a couple other ones that I'm forgetting, Austin Trout when he was undefeated. Like, the resume is not really even that close. It's in completely different galaxies.
Was never one or two on that list before Lomachenko lost. You see, when Lomachenko lost, ESPN always wanted to put Canelo Alvarez as number one, but they knew it was hard to justify because they had already had Crawford at number two. But eventually...
I understand overall what you're saying, Dante, and maybe you can make that point for ESPN. But for those of us that are logical and objective, Canelo, in my view, was always above Terrence Bud Crawford on the list.
They said, forget it. No one is paying attention to this. So when no one was looking, they went ahead and they put Canelo over Terrence Crawford. And shortly after they put Canelo on top of Terrence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez loses, just like Lomachenko did. Which brings us...
Yes, he lost, but let's take a look at the reason why Canelo Alvarez lost. Because there's no offense against Terrence Bud Crawford, but he has never been the definitive number one pound for pound fighter in boxing. Never. And there's a reason for that. And Dante can allege racism all the living long damn day, but the truth is about Terrence Bud Crawford is that his resume is so weak compared to some of these other fighters. If we're really going to go there, he doesn't even have the resume of a Tyson Fury. It is what it is. Because even Tyson Fury can claim that once upon a time he beat a top 10 pound for pound fighter, and on top of that, he beat Deontay Wilder, which was looked at as a lifetime generational type of matchup. How many matchups has Terence Crawford really been in where we say, wow, he really had a chance to lose that fight? Maybe Yuriorkis Gamboa and Sean Porter, maybe. That's about it.
Back to my longevity point.
And those guys, in my opinion, are not A-plus fighters.
So ESPN, every single person that ESPN put number one on their list.
Because let me just state this. Let's say Terence Bud Crawford goes in against Errol Spence Jr. Let's say he gets knocked out. What then? Because what resume do you really have? If you go in there against Errol Spence Jr. and if you end up getting dominated or if you end up losing, what wins in your career do you really have to state that you still deserve to be within the top 5 pound per pound? Because Canelo Alvarez, when he lost to Dimitri Bivol, I still could easily debate him logically and objectively that he's within that top 5 pound per pound. You can't do that with Terence Bud Crawford because he doesn't have the resume. It just is what it is. Anyway.
It's almost like they put a curse on that fighter because they always end up losing shortly after they call them number one. The only fighters that don't lose, at least right away, when they're put in that number one spot are the black fighters.
And Dante goes again with that, and that shows you his whole motivations. And sometimes the black fighters do not lose when it comes down to it, but the only black fighters as of recent that I can remember that were number one pound per pound, at least definitively, were Andre Ward, who also retired shortly after he beat Sergey Kovalev. When we never hear Dante, we never hear him say, why did Andre Ward retire? He wasn't super, there for the longevity. We never hear him say that. So it is what it is. But I understand what Dante is getting at. But at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez, a big part of the reason why he lost is because he went up against one of the best fighters in the world, against Dimitri Bivol, someone who is decently bigger than him and also very decently skilled. Has Crawford ever had a fight like that in his career? Not even close.
Because they deserve to be put there. We all know that the majority of the best black fighters in the world, they are going to outlast almost all of these non-black boxers that ESPN and the rest of old media desperately keep trying to put on their list as high as they can. They tried to replace Terence.
Well, at times, yes. But right now, once again, the pound for pound list is very, very competitive. And when you have a fighter like a Canelo Alvarez or a Vasily Lomachenko that is doing great things in the sport, at times you are going to have to put him at the number one pound for pound spot. Just is what it is.
Offered with chocolate.
And there's no offense against Terence Bud Crawford, but I really don't know how truly great that he actually is. Because Canelo Alvarez has been taking fights that have been very challenging for himself for the past 10 plus years. Terence Crawford has only had about 2 to 3 fights that maybe were even slightly challenging.
So Gonzalez, with Golovkin, with Canelo Alvarez, and Terence Crawford.
And that basically shows you Dante's motivation. And that's overall why he has this attitude of, we can't have a Canelo Alvarez at the number one pound per pound spot. They're always trying to tear down our black fighters when we're truly the most dominant ones in the sport. And a lot of the times, black fighters are the most dominant ones in the sport. But there's nothing wrong with putting a Canelo Alvarez at number one overall if he deserves to truly be there, which he did. But anyway.
Is still undefeated. He's still on top of the sport.
Well, yeah, he's still undefeated, but against who? Once again, I need to see you in the ring with an Errol Spence Jr. I mean, it just is what it is.
Very, very good chance that Devin Haney and Shakur Stevenson will outlast almost everyone on ESPN's hope list. And that's what you call...
Well, we're going to see about that, Dante, because once again, we need the competition to rise. Okay? We need the competition to rise. And if we're also going to make that point, there's going to be a very decent chance that Tyson Fury, overall could outlast a certain amount of people, but you don't want to put him on your top 10 pound per pound list because we all know that you hate Tyson Fury with a burning passion. Anyway.
Longevity on the pound for pound list. So at the end of the day, we need all of the professional boxing.
Well, the pound per pound list once again only becomes about longevity when overall you've already done great things and you keep doing it for a long amount of time, or a great amount of time. Longevity can't be based on, well, we think that you're going to be on this list for this amount of time, because all that is hypothetical. There's a great amount of people that once upon a time probably thought that Adrian Broner was going to stay on the top 10 pound for pound list, and look at him.
Community to continue to expose what ESPN is doing right now.
So last year, I paid nothing for electricity, and I actually made money by using a special.
It's doing right now. It's important to talk about because ESPN is the biggest sporting network in the country. Now, see, I don't talk too much about the Ring magazine because Oscar De La Hoya owns it. So that alone makes that more irrelevant because it's somewhat of a conflict of interest. But I do want to make an educational video so you guys know the history of the pound for pound list when it comes to the Ring magazine. And we've already put together our new media list. We're just working on the video right now to drop it. So that's coming real soon since all of you guys have been asking for that. I'll close out with this final point. You guys really need to pay attention to what's going on. Paulie Malignaggi, he got fired for being racist, for saying racist things. Showtime, they fired him. And what?
Well, apparently Paulie Malignaggi got fired for allegedly saying racist things, but what did Paulie Malignaggi really say that was that bad? Because Devin Haney was the one that came out first and said that he'll never let a white boy beat him, which I never thought was that big of a deal. But if you're going to say something like that, which of course is going to be a little bit of an explosive statement when it comes at it, because it's a little bit racially charged, all Paulie Malignaggi said was that at the time, a lot of the Eastern European fighters were the ones dominating the sport. That's all he said. And Dante got his panties in a twist about that. But anyway.
The things that he said, and this was just the tip of the iceberg, he said it's no longer the black boxer's time in the sport of boxing. Now the sport is dominated by white European fighters. Now, once Paulie came out of the closet, he said much more racist things about black people than that. But my point is...
Really? What specifically? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he did. I don't know. But once again, you can't overall go on and saying racially charged statements and not expect something to come back to you. And that's exactly what Dante is. Dante is almost like that bully or that person on the know that believes that he can say anything. And then when something comes back to him, he gets his panties in a twist. Anyway.
Clearly, the racist views that Paulie had towards black boxers, ESPN and the rest of old media, they felt the same way because ever since Paulie said that, ESPN, they have tried their best to keep their pound for pound list looking the way Paulie always envisioned it to look. This is the reason why they desperately try to fill their list up with the majority of white European fighters and non-black boxers. You see, clearly they wouldn't dare repeat what Paulie Malignaggi said, but they share the same vision. Their dream is boxing will be the white version of the NBA. And that ain't gonna never happen, no matter how many anti-black pound for pound lists they put up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
And once again, with Dante, I agree with him slightly that maybe ESPN overall, that they do have some racial issues. But Dante, as he showed you in this video, he does have a lot of racial issues himself. And to the point to where he cannot admit overall when there's a Caucasian fighter or overall a Latino fighter or something of another demographic, to where he cannot even admit that they're great because he is so caught up in his feelings. And he always has the mentality of they're always trying to attack us. And listen, I get it to a degree. But at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with putting Canelo Alvarez at the #1 pound for pound spot or giving credit to Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury, especially if they do seem overall to last for a very decently long time. And Dante talks about longevity. Well, Alexander Usyk and Canelo Alvarez and Tyson Fury, those are examples of fighters that have outlasted not only other fighters, but also other black fighters as well. Because Usyk was able to beat AJ, Fury was able to beat Deontay Wilder, who once upon a time you had on your top 10 pound per pound list. And Canelo Alvarez has been able to beat the majority of the people that he has had in the ring with him. But anyway, that's really about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that because I found it very particularly interesting. But that's really about it for this list. Thought it was interesting, and that's pretty much about it for today.